Dark Side of the Ring this week covered the story of former WWE, WCW, and ECW star and former ECW World Heavyweight Champion Bam Bam Bigelow, the Beast from the East. I enjoyed this one very much. Bam Bam is another one of those names from my young wrestling fandom that you don't forget, with the tattooed head and the flame gear. He stood out. I remember playing as him in the first Wrestlemania game for Nintendo. For some reason, I think Bam Bam was one of the few characters in the game who couldn't do a body slam. And I still don't know why. But Bigelow is one of the most talented big men ever in the history of the business. He said in interviews he wants to be remembered as the best big man ever in the business, which is something that Bret Hart once said. He called Bam Bam the best big man in the business. He said always so strong, so quick, and most of all, he was safe, a real pro in the ring. That's a pretty big endorsement, and coming from someone who worked with Bam Bam a number of times. As a fan, I can't call him the best big man wrestler I've ever seen. I still think Vader in his prime and Undertaker are at the top of that list, but Bam Bam is on there for sure. The talking heads for this one included Diamond Dallas Page, who knew him from the Jersey Shore before either of them really broke in or hit it big in the business. DDP was running a club there at the time. Bigelow was only 17 years old, but they were downing shots together. Nobody cared because even at that age, he looked like a grown man. Taz was interviewed for this. He worked with Bam Bam in ECW. Shane Douglas, who also worked with him in ECW. They were members of the Triple Threat. Dave Meltzer was back. Bigelow's ex-wife Dana was interviewed, and his 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl, who was very young when he died. And she did not waste any time sharing a very sad story about the last time that she saw her dad. She was only 3 years old, riding in the passenger seat of his car, and she looked over and noticed, as he was driving, that his head kept dropping down like he was dozing off. Even at that age, she had the presence of mind to try to wake him up and tell him, I gotta go use the bathroom, which woke him up. He pulled the car over. She was trying to stall. I don't even know if she actually had to go to the bathroom or not, but she was trying to stall, and he told her, come on, get back in the car so we can keep going. And then it happened again. So they pull into a diner, and that's when the police arrived and grabbed her out of the car, and she was scared to death. They were taking her away from her dad, and she watched as they took him away in handcuffs, and that was the last time she ever saw him. So they started with the heavy stuff right away. We would come back around to it later on, but they kind of hit you with that story right out of the gate. His kids showed us old photos of him with hair, which is just bizarre to see. It's kind of like the first time I saw King Kong Bundy with hair. It just didn't look right. And then we get into the story of, actually various stories. Let's call it story time with Bam Bam. Where DDP says he heard a rumor once upon a time that Bigelow got into a fight. He bit someone's ear off. And we got the reenactment of the person getting their ear bitten off and blood flies everywhere. Whether it's true or not, he said it's all part of the legend of Bam Bam. And he admits that with Scott, as he calls him, it could be all exaggerated. It's nonetheless part of kind of the lore of Bam Bam Bigelow. I'm glad he said that because there's no doubt in my mind that some of these stories are either exaggerated or more than exaggerated, if they happened at all. There's the bounty hunter story. His son, Scott Colton Bigelow, don't tell CM Punk, he spoke. He said that he knows his dad was a bounty hunter once upon a time for a very short period of time, but he didn't know the details. And then they cut to audio of Bam Bam himself from a shoot interview talking about when he was 18 or 19, he ended up going to Mexico to find a little girl that had been kidnapped to bring her home. In the process, his partner gets shot in the neck and killed, and he ends up in a Mexican prison for 6 months. His other son says that what happened is that he befriended the judge because the judge found out that Bigelow would routinely plow through the cell walls in jail. They weren't able to keep him contained because the walls were so thin, he could just break right through them, and they couldn't keep him in any one spot. So the judge says, look, I need security in court to protect me from these cartel guys so they don't lunge at me and try to stab me. If you do that for me, I'll reduce your sentence. And so that's what he did. Now, did he really get arrested and thrown into a Mexican prison? Possibly. Did it go down exactly the way they said in this episode? Probably not. There was a Sports Illustrated story that I found from 1986 on the Monster Factory after Bam Bam joined and he started training to be a wrestler that mentions the bounty hunter story. And in that version of it, it said Bigelow gave up bounty hunting the year before after a fugitive that he was hunting shot him in the back and he was put in prison for 6 months. So in one version, his partner was shot and killed, and in this version, he was shot. So take your pick which one you want to believe. That wasn't the only stint in jail for him, by the way. This was not mentioned in the episode, but he actually put together quite the rap sheet over the years before he got married. This was covered by the Asbury Park Sunday Press in a story that ran the day of his match with LT at Wrestlemania XI. There were burglaries, robbery and attempted kidnapping. There was an aggravated assault charge from a motorcycle gang fight where he claimed he was only defending himself. There was a sexual assault charge in 1985 with a prostitute in Asbury Park, which he claimed was just a fight over payment. So he got into a lot of trouble back then. The story about him saving the kids from a fire was mentioned. And I've gotten questions over the years, like mailbag questions from people asking about this. So I know that this was something I was hoping they would cover, and they didn't really cover it very extensively here, but it's become part of the legend of Bam Bam from the end of his career. His own son mentioned the story. He brought up the story, and he kind of shrugged his shoulders, like he couldn't say whether it was true or not, only that he heard the same story that everybody else did. Shane Douglas said that story, like a lot of the ones around him, sound like TV movies. But he finds them all to at least be plausible. I think it's been widely accepted that he got burned in some kind of a house fire, but there are a lot of discrepancies in the stories. This is the version that Bigelow told from an interview that he gave in 2004. He said, "I was coming home from Japan on an ECW trip. It was about 3:30 in the morning, and I was turning onto my block, and I realized there was a fire. I heard kids crying, and I went through the door, and the whole upstairs was on fire. I had to run through a wall," I guess just like he did in the Mexican prison. "I had to run through a wall in the house. I ran through a wall, 2x4s and all, so I could get to the back way to get up the stairs. I landed right in a ball of fire. It was the best move I made. When I finally made it upstairs, I grabbed the 3 kids and came back through the same fire, and now I was on fire. By the time I came down, the front stairs were down, so we would have died if we would have gone that way. The mom had been out drinking and left the kids alone. She was a single mother. The kids were 5, 8, and 9. They started a fire somehow. I did what anybody would have tried to do. I burned 40% of my body with second-degree burns and spent almost 2 months in the hospital. It's really ironic that a guy who wore flames almost his entire career and has his head tattooed can be burned 40% and not have scars. Maybe that was my calling and I missed it." Now, I don't know if someone can be burned 40% of their body and not have scars. Maybe it's possible. Maybe because it was second degree and not third degree. I don't know. The problem is, the incident happened in the summer of 2000, long after Bigelow had left ECW. He was working for WCW at the time. He hadn't worked for ECW since 1998. Not only that, I found a story from the Orlando Sentinel dated July 14th, 2000. It's the only mainstream media coverage I could find of this that had a different story. It said WCW wrestler Bam Bam Bigelow is recuperating at home following a bizarre July 4th accident during a barbecue near his home in Wayside, New Jersey. Bigelow suffered burns over 40% of his body when a brush fire broke out near the cookout. Bigelow was trying to help several people get away from the flames when he suffered second-degree burns on his arms, legs, and most of the left side of his body. He spent 10 days in the hospital but is expected to make a full recovery. That sounds more plausible to me, that there was a brush fire at a barbecue, he tried to get some people out of the way. Was it a bunch of little kids in a burning house home alone at 3:30 in the middle of the night? I don't know. It makes for a better story, though. Right? Like Shane Douglas said, it's like a TV movie. It makes for a better story. He did miss a few months from WCW. He did miss a few months before he came back, I think, in October of that year. He didn't wrestle again until then. So I don't doubt there was some kind of an accident, but that should put the Fire story into some perspective, because even his own friends and his own son seemed a little skeptical of the details of that one. Bigelow ends up training with Larry Sharpe at the Monster Factory in New Jersey. Nature Boy Buddy Rogers trained him also. He co-founded the Monster Factory with Sharpe, but Buddy wasn't mentioned here. A lot of names have come out of that school, including 3 WrestleMania headliners: Bam Bam Bigelow, Big Show, and King Kong Bundy. But Bam Bam was their first breakout graduate. When Bret Hart traveled to Dublin many years ago, this was in the early 2000s, Sheamus went over to talk to him and said that he wanted to become a wrestler, and Bret said, hey, Larry is the guy to go train with. So he got trained also at the Monster Factory, did Sheamus. Damian Priest, Matt Riddle, Raven, a lot of names. There's video online of Bam Bam getting his head tattooed from a news piece at a local television station that they did on the Monster Factory. And Bam Bam just leaned back in the chair. He's chilling. You know, the guy's tattooing his skull while he talks to the reporter. And they show part of the video in the episode here also. In my review of the Adrian Adonis episode of Dark Side a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned a little known fact about Adonis, maybe, being the first real Paul Heyman guy. That was before Heyman really got big as a manager. Meltzer in this episode mentioned that Heyman was doing work for the wrestling magazines at the time. This is before he started managing. And he really built up Bigelow in the magazines. He was building him up like crazy because he had heard about him. This is before he even had his first match. Heyman was also doing publicity at the time for Studio 54 in New York, and he booked Bigelow's first ever match to take place at Studio 54, which Meltzer says he saw, and he thought, first time he saw Bam Bam, he thought Bigelow was going to be the biggest star in the business because of the things that he was doing for a man his size, flying off the top rope and doing cartwheels in the ring. Heyman being the one to book Bam Bam's first match is a whole story unto itself. He was going to present Hulk Hogan with the Man of the Year award that night. And he knew that if he promoted a wrestling show there with the debut of Bam Bam Bigelow, then nobody knew who the guy was, right? He hadn't even wrestled his first match yet. The name Bam Bam Bigelow didn't mean a damn thing to anybody, in or out of wrestling. But if he came up with a reason to promote Hulk Hogan is coming to Studio 54, it would be huge. So Hogan pulled out at the last minute. And again, you might be wondering, Man of the Year award, where's that from? Nowhere. He made it up. It's a completely manufactured award. But he was going to present it to Hogan. Hogan pulled out at the last minute. So Heyman calls up Crockett, and they end up flying Ric Flair up in his place to accept this completely manufactured award for Man of the Year, which again only existed so they would have a reason to host the Bam Bam match. Dusty Rhodes made an appearance as well. They flew up, Flair and Dusty, I think, on Crockett's private plane. In the match, Bam Bam wrestled 4 other guys. He beat all 4 of them. Probably all students of the Monster Factory would be my guess. They said Vince McMahon saw money in Bam Bam, and he wanted to make him the next big thing. And I remember, this was right around the time I started watching wrestling. And they had all the managers vying for his services when he first came in, just like they did with Randy Savage in '85 when he came in. So Slick thought that he had the inside track and he had won the Bam Bam sweepstakes, and he brought him out on an episode of Wrestling Challenge. But Bigelow came out with Oliver Humperdinck as his new manager instead. And Humperdinck also managed Paul Orndorff after he broke away from the Heenan family. For a guy with only 2 years of experience in the business, they were pushing this guy to the moon. He wrestled in the main event of the very first Survivor Series. Hulk Hogan was one of his partners. He even outlasted Hogan. He was the last member of his team, the last member of the babyface team left standing before ultimately he fell to Andre the Giant. But this was only a couple of months after his debut on Challenge. And there he was being pushed as the number 2 babyface in this match behind Hulk Hogan. Honestly, it would have actually made more sense to have Bam Bam win that first Royal Rumble match in '88 than Hacksaw Jim Duggan. He was already headlining live events at that point against Ted DiBiase. He was tagging with Hogan. When I looked it up, he wasn't even in the Royal Rumble match. Tito Santana is listed as a sub for Bam Bam Bigelow. I'm not sure why, if it was injury related, I'm not sure. I know he wasn't hurt, actually, so it couldn't have been an injury. It wasn't an injury because he wrestled the next night at Madison Square Garden. He tagged with Hogan against DiBiase and Virgil. so it couldn't have been an injury. But his wife said they were married in November of 87, and Bigelow was already back on the road the next day. She said that's probably why their marriage lasted as long as it did. She has really nothing bad to say about him because she only got to see him maybe 10 times a year. But with a big push like that at a young age comes a lot of jealousy from the veterans who busted their asses a lot longer. And there were rumors of him also not having a great attitude. Enter Andre the Giant. If Andre liked you, how many times have we heard stories? If Andre liked you, life was good. If Andre didn't like you, watch out. And Andre did not like Bam Bam Bigelow. Apparently he didn't like Bam Bam and he didn't like Randy Savage either. They showed footage of a match that they had at Madison Square Garden, which took place, it was June 25th, 1988. It aired on the July 25th episode of Primetime Wrestling, and it turned out to be Bam Bam's final WWE match for almost 5 years. During the match, you could clearly see Andre is roughing this guy up. He's got him over by the ropes. He's choking him out with the top rope. All Bam Bam is worried about is not going out and letting Andre choke him out in the middle of MSG. On Colt Cabana's Art of Wrestling podcast in 2013, Ted DiBiase was on. He remembered when Bam Bam debuted there in 87, he said that he had a bad attitude. And according to DiBiase, Andre took issue with this. He said, Andre kind of roughed him up in a match. I remember it because it was the Garden in New York. And he said he was lacing up his boots in the dressing room for his match with Randy Savage that night. They had a cage match in the main event that night. When Bigelow stormed in after the match was over, he grabbed his bags and he said, I quit. And he left. And then Andre came in later on and said, I taught him a lesson. Jim Duggan has told a very similar story before that Andre was very heavy-handed with Bam Bam that night and that he rolled out of the ring, he walked back to the dressing room, got his bag, and he left the arena. Bret Hart, in his book, when talking about Bam Bam's return to the company in 1992, said that he returned with a much improved attitude. So the attitude thing has been mentioned by more than a few wrestlers who would have been on the roster with him at that time. When he came back, he got a pretty strong push in the first half of 93. He was supposed to wrestle Kamala at WrestleMania 9. Their match got cut for time, according to Bruce Pritchard, to make sure that Hulk Hogan had plenty of time to pose at the end of the show. Last month, I did a watch-along for the 30th anniversary of the 1993 King of the Ring, and I watched the Bret Hart Bam Bam Bigelow match in the finals, and it was really good. And I can't ever watch that finish the same way again after hearing Bigelow in one of his shoot interviews mention that when Bret rolled him up for the victory roll, Bret farted in Bam Bam's face. That's one way to finish off your opponent. In the episode, they talked about his match with Lawrence Taylor at WrestleMania XI. So after they split him away from Luna Vachon, who managed him for a while, right? She was his main squeeze. He joined Ted DiBiase's $1 Million Corporation. If you don't know, Lawrence Taylor is one of the all-time greats in the NFL. He played for the New York Giants. He had retired a couple of years before this. Business was down. Business was way down in 95. Vince McMahon was looking for a big attraction for WrestleMania. So they brought in Lawrence Taylor to wrestle. And they shot this great angle at the Royal Rumble where after Bam Bam lost his match, he's walking by, LT in the front row. And LT is laughing at him. He's having a good old time. And Bigelow gives him a big old shove. He wasn't laughing anymore after that. It was a well-done angle. Meltzer says this was not a match for the wrestling fans. This was a match for the general public. Bruce Pritchard has said before that the reason they chose Bam Bam for the spot was that he was this big, tough-looking guy. Like somebody that you would think could actually kick LT's ass. And LT at the time was seen as a tough guy himself. But here's this big wrestler with tattoos on his head, right? He looked the part, which is why they went with him. Bam Bam's wife said that he made more for that one match than most people make in a year. And Bam Bam has said that he got $250,000 for the match. WrestleMania 11, probably the worst WrestleMania of all time. The Caesars Palace one, I know it gets a lot of hate. That wasn't a great WrestleMania either, but I still like it more than WrestleMania 11. The bar has been raised in recent years, though, as far as celebrity matches go. We've seen Logan Paul, we've seen Bad Bunny, we've seen Pat McAfee. LT was not at their level as far as celebrity matches go, but he put in a respectable enough performance and Bam Bam carried him to a pretty decent match overall, all things considered. He got paid $250,000 to make LT look good in 12 minutes. And he did his job. He bumped his ass off for that guy. Bigelow's son says that he's seen people call it the worst WrestleMania main event of all time. It's not. I'm going to tell you right now, it's not. It's not a great match by any means, but it was more entertaining than watching Drew McIntyre wrestle Brock Lesnar in an empty warehouse. It was more entertaining than watching The Undertaker turn in one of the worst matches of his life against Roman Reigns. A match so bad, he refused to watch it back when it was over. It was more entertaining than watching John Cena wrestle The Miz in a Raw main event, masquerading as a WrestleMania main event. And a match that existed only to set up the following year's main event. That was the worst part of the whole thing. So whichever one you want to settle on, LT against Bam Bam is not the worst WrestleMania main event of all time. It's pretty far down there. But it probably isn't even in the bottom 3, if we're being honest. So he went from working a mixed tag match against Doink and Dink at WrestleMania X to 1 year later main eventing with Lawrence Taylor. And then, in the same year that he headlined WrestleMania a few months after this, he left the company. I don't know what, if anything, he may have been promised coming out of that show, but it was clear they were turning him babyface, and he was going to be leaving DiBiase's crew. It was obvious that night when DiBiase was scolding him as they were walking to the back for being an embarrassment. Was he promised a big push after WrestleMania 11? I've read conflicting things about that over the years. But they were turning him babyface, and he seemed to be in line for a big push. The problem is, Bam Bam turned face at the exact same time that WWE turned Shawn Michaels babyface. And I think that really hurt him, and it overshadowed his own turn, because Shawn was a bigger star than him. That, and there probably were Kliq politics backstage that derailed his push. I know Bam Bam complained about the Kliq in interviews. I mean, a lot of people have complained about the Kliq. Bam Bam was one of many. A lot of people complained about those guys and their influence over Vince McMahon. So Bam Bam, he negotiates an early release from his contract later on in 95. And he said that he and Vince left things on good terms, that, they let him out of his deal a year early, under the provision that he not appear on any pay-per-views before the deal would have expired. So it was not at least from the perspective of Bigelow and McMahon, it was not a terrible split or anything like that, but he had his reasons for wanting out of there. Keep in mind, Bam Bam was also good friends with Chris Candido and Shane Douglas, so he saw how the Kliq treated Candido, which was not good, and how they influenced Douglas's push. Remember, as Dean Douglas, and I'm sure he probably saw that and just said, the hell with this, I'm getting out of here. They're treating my friends like this, and he thinks they're treating him like that, and they're holding him back in some way. Then what's the point in even being here anymore? I've heard him say that he had no problem with Kevin Nash, that Nash was only a dick when he was around his friends, but if you dealt with him one-on-one, he was cool. There is one story I wanted to share, not to go too far off the beaten path here, but since I brought up Nash. Nash told this on his podcast last year. I had never heard this before, and it doesn't paint Bigelow in the best light, but it's just one of those wild tales from the road. So they're at the airport one day, and Bam Bam asks Hall Nash if he could ride with them because he didn't have a credit card on him to rent a car. So they're like, sure, get in the back seat. So they were headed to the next show in Sacramento, and when they get to Sacramento, they pull over at a convenience store to go grab some beer. While they're in the store, this is according to Nash, a group of gang members walk in. They happen to be Hispanic. And they recognize the wrestlers, and they showed them nothing but love. Nash starts talking to them and asking them, hey, what are you guys drinking tonight? And they say they don't know. What are you drinking? And he and Scott were buying Miller Lights. So they start razzing, Hall and Nash about drinking light beer. And Nash jokes with them. He goes, we got to keep our figures, so we look good in the ring. And he asked one of the guys if they could get by them so they could pay. And they're like, yeah, cool. No problem. So everything is cool. Bam Bam is in a different line. And one of the, gang members is behind him, and he asks Bam Bam, hey, is that tattoo on your head? Did that hurt to get? And Bam Bam tells him, nah, you just can't be a pussy. You got to be a man. And the guy asks him, you're that wrestler dude, right? And Bam Bam tells him, no, I'm a killer. I'm a serial killer. And the guy says, yeah, what do you kill, motherfucker? Kellogg's? And Bam Bam says, no, I kill... And then he uses a derogatory ethnic slur for Hispanics that I will not repeat, but it starts with the letter S, so you can figure it out. Nash sees this. He says he's standing right there. He can remember it clear as day. He's thinking, this is the last day of my fucking life. Because they're with Bam Bam, and they know that they're with him. So now the guys behind him, they drop their beer, and they walk out of the store. The wrestlers finish paying for their beer. They walk out, and the gang members are all standing around outside. And before Nash could even apologize, one of the guys says to him, it's not on you, bro. You were nothing but cool. So he and Scott are walking to their car. He turns, and he looks back, and he sees one of the guys with an automatic pistol pressed up against Bam Bam's forehead. So Nash goes over, he offers to give them money. He had almost $200 on him. He's going to give him cash. And the guy goes, nah, man, fuck that. And he pistol whips Bam Bam with the butt of the gun. So Bam Bam now, he gets away from this. He gets back into the car with Hall and Nash. And Nash is thinking, as soon as we pull out, these guys are going to light this car up, right? I think he said they're going to Mac 10 this Chrysler. So he takes off. They're driving through some residential area. He's gunning it. And Bam Bam is in the backseat. He's like, slow down. You don't want the cops to pull you over. And Nash says, no, that's exactly what I want. So they get on the interstate. Scott Hall is pissed. By this point, he and Nash have not said a word to each other. But he looks over at Nash. He tells him, pull the car over. So Nash pulls the car over on the side of the road. And Scott Hall proceeds to cut what Nash says was the mother of all promos on Bam Bam, who's sitting in the back seat. If I hear you one more time say you're from Asbury Park, New Jersey, and you're street smart, and you're this and you're that, he says you're a fat motherfucker with tattoos. After this trip, you are never going to ride with us again. And Bam Bam didn't say anything because he knew both of them wanted to kill him. And he probably knew they had every right to want to kill him after that. What would possess you to say something like that in that situation? So that was the last time that Bam Bam Bigelow ever rode with the Kliq, according to Kevin Nash. Something not mentioned in this episode, and that most people probably don't even know about, or maybe they forgot about it, was that in between his stints in WWE and ECW, Bam Bam had his one and only MMA fight in Japan. And actually, he had already started working for ECW by that point, but I don't think he was really being used full time yet until the following year. But it was November of 1996. How many of you remember the name Chemo? Chemo Leopoldo from the early days of UFC. Chemo was a scary looking SOB. I didn't watch UFC back then, but I would see these commercials sometimes. I'm trying to think, how would I have even seen these commercials? They must have been time buys during like the WWE and WCW shows. But I remember seeing this guy Chemo, and again, he looked like a beast. And he had fight experience. Bam Bam did not. The streets don't count. Not when you're locked in a cage with somebody who's had actual training. You can't say, oh, I'm trained in the streets. Yeah, okay, but you're not trained to be a cage fighter. That's a whole different ball of wax. So Chemo's only two losses up to that point came against Hoist Gracie and Ken Shamrock, right? Two pretty big names. The promotion that ran the show had it as their main event. And the reason they wanted Bigelow was because they needed somebody with a recognizable name and somebody who had notoriety in Japan. Bam Bam checked both of those boxes. In Japan, he had worked with names over there like Inoki and Tenryu and Vader, so people knew who he was. Chemo, and you can see the fight yourself, it's online. Chemo instantly takes him down. He mounts him, and he just beat the living crap out of him. And there was nothing Bigelow could do. He had no technique. He could barely cover up. He had no strategy. He had no way to get out of it. All he could do is just lay there and try to just cover his face. Eventually, Chemo choked him out. Fight was over in the first round. This was not Bam Bam following the Brock Lesnar path. This was not Bam Bam following the CM Punk path. Brock Lesnar wanted to become an elite fighter in mixed martial arts, and he ended up becoming a world champion in the UFC. CM Punk, I give the guy credit for following his dreams, if nothing else. He had a camp, he trained, he tried, he put the work in. He really wanted to try to make it as a fighter. It didn't work out. Bam Bam just did it for a paycheck, nothing more. He claimed his payday for the fight was supposed to be $30,000 for what would have been a shoot, but then once they told him they wanted him to take a dive, is what he claimed, and do a job. And then he said that's when his price started to go up. He wanted $100,000, which he got. He claimed he got $100,000 for the fight. When he showed up, Bam Bam claimed they told him, "Oh, we want you to put chemo over." And he figured, well, I'm getting $100,000, so what the hell? So Bam Bam's claim was that it was a work. And it wouldn't be the first work shoot that took place in Japan, but I think what happened is he got his ass handed to him, and he was too proud to admit it, right? He had a reputation to protect. So after the fact, he tells people, oh, it's all a work. I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. It wasn't just that he got beat, he got humiliated that night. I might claim it was a work too if I were him, but I don't buy it. But we got some great insight in this episode from Taz into their famous bump from their match at Living Dangerously in '98, where Bigelow won the ECW television title. Paul Heyman calls Taz one day and he says, Bam Bam's going to beat you for the TV title and he's going to put you through the ring. You can add that spot to the list of things that WWE stole from ECW. Heyman asked Taz, what do you think? And Taz says his reaction was, I'm going to die. And then Taz proceeded to give us the rundown on how the rings are constructed, how the ring break spot is done, and he admits he feels dirty explaining all of this on camera. I love the inside baseball stuff like this, though. Bigelow's main concern was how Taz's head was going to keep from hitting one of the support beams on the way down. And they get the signal during the match that the trap door is open, and Taz says if you watch closely, Bigelow reaches for the rope. Like, he's got Taz on his back. Bigelow rather, is kind of grabbing a hold of the top rope and slowly moving backwards. And what he's doing by touching the top rope is Bam Bam is trying to feel for a small piece of white tape. That little piece of tape marked the spot where it would be safe for them to fall backwards so that Taz wouldn't crack his skull open. And so they fall into the hole, and Taz says the first thing Bam Bam asked him, they're laying in this hole together, he turns and he asks him, are you okay? He goes, that's the kind of guy that Bam Bam Bigelow was. All he was concerned about in that moment is making sure that he was okay. And once he realized they were okay, they both start laughing because they hear the crowd reaction. The crowd's going nuts for this. They had never seen anything like that before. And they knew they had them. This was my favorite part of the whole episode, honestly, was this segment here with Taz telling this story. But then, as the name of the show suggests, things got dark. A lot of talk about pain pills in wrestling. Vince McMahon tested for cocaine. He tested for marijuana. But if you had a prescription for something, you were good. All you had to do really was find a marked doctor, and they would give you anything you wanted. Sometimes they would want something in return. You would give them autographs for their kids. Maybe you'd give them tickets to the shows when they came to town. But you can get anything from a doctor if you were a star. Bam Bam would get these prescription bottles of OxyContin. His kids said they had never seen pill bottles this big before. Hundreds of pills in them. And then what happens after a while when 1 or 2 pills is not giving you the relief that you need, you double up on the dosage, and then you triple up, and then you quadruple. And after a while, his son said that his dad was taking 15 to 20 Oxy a day. I took 1 Oxy pill once, and I was in La La Land. I had to cut the pill in half after that, just to take half a pill because I didn't like the way it made me feel. Now, I'm not as big of a man as Bam Bam Bigelow was, physically, but still, I can't imagine how he was able to function day to day on 20 pills. But we hear these stories all the time with wrestlers from that era. Same thing with the somas and the muscle relaxers. They didn't call it a soma coma for nothing. These guys were like walking zombies. They also revealed in the episode that Bam Bam was a diabetic, which I don't think had ever been mentioned publicly before. So he was dealing with that as well while he was working, trying to keep that in check. But he had all sorts of injuries. He had spinal stenosis. He had crushed discs. Sections of his back were fused together, which I never knew. His family says the pills allowed him to go out and make money. His wife said their kids meant the world to him. When they had a daughter, he was over the moon. He was elated. They were the most important thing in his life. But once the pills got a hold of him, it became the most important thing in his life over anything else. She would call his doctor and tell him, stop giving my husband prescriptions. And the doctor would go around her back to Bam Bam to rat her out. She said Scott sold his soul for Oxy, and he would have stepped over his family in the street to get to them. That's a pretty powerful statement. DDP helped get him into WCW in '98, and they held the tag team titles. That was back when they were part of the Jersey Triad with Chris Kanyon. After a while, he became such a liability to the company, he started missing shows because of the drug use. They actually paid him to just sit at home. They didn't want him on the road anymore. I know he claimed in an interview that when WWE bought WCW, the reason he didn't go was because he had a guaranteed deal paying him what he claimed was $80,000 a month. So he opted to sit home and collect his money. That would work out to be almost $1 million a year. And I know WCW was not always the most fiscally responsible when it came to contracts that they were doling out, but I don't buy that Bigelow was making anywhere near $1 million a year. I've read elsewhere that he was being paid over $400,000 a year. That, to me, is more believable. Then they came back to his daughter. And the story that she shared at the beginning of the episode about being in the car with her dad when she was 3 and he started dozing off and the cops came and took her away. That was the last time she ever saw her dad. She wrote a paper about it for school when she was in the 8th grade. And he got charged with endangering the welfare of a child for that. They didn't mention this in the episode, but I think Bam Bam claimed it was due to a seizure. He said, no, I had a seizure. That's why I was dozing off. It wasn't that I was falling asleep. He blamed it on that. And I think the charge was dismissed a few months later. I don't know the circumstances around that, but I think it did get dismissed. But his wife gave him an ultimatum. Either you shape up and get help, or you got to go. And he refused to get help. He didn't think he had a problem. So they ended up getting a divorce. He still wrestled occasionally in the years after WCW closed. I know he opened a deli in Pennsylvania for a while that sold what he called the 1-pound beast burger. That lasted a few years. At the end of 2004, he dropped off the face of the earth for a while. Nobody could find him. One of his best friends in the business died a few months later. I think it probably was Chris Candido. If the timeline matches up, I think it does. And he didn't show up at the funeral. Were it not for a fan who snapped a picture of him in Florida that summer, nobody would have known he was even alive. His ex-wife, the one that was interviewed here, she sued him 3 different times in 2005 for failing to pay child support. I know at one point he owed $9,000 in back child support. I don't know if that number climbed even higher. It probably did. His probation officer at the time said that he did pay something, but he wasn't paying like he should, and that if he were there, I guess by that he meant still in New Jersey, because he would have been living in Florida by then. But if he were there, his probation officer said that he would do a bench warrant for his arrest. This is a man who, at his peak, was making in the high 6 figures at least. And he lost everything, he claimed, in his divorce. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, his house. Late in his life, he was living on Social Security disability. Which, if you know anything about Social Security, that ain't much. He had debt collectors coming after him. His medical bills were mounting. He still owed child support. In one interview that I saw, he said, you can't pay what you can't afford. Another thing that wasn't covered in the episode was the motorcycle wreck that he had in 2005 where his girlfriend almost died. So he was riding his brother's Harley. He got stopped at an intersection. The light turned green. He sped off. Then he stopped again, I guess, at another intersection. There was a witness who saw him both times almost tip over. And she was concerned enough that she dialed 911. Then he tried to change from the outside lane to the inside lane, going somewhere in between 80 and 90 miles an hour, and the bike went down. Neither he nor his girlfriend were wearing helmets. He landed 50 feet up the road. The woman who saw the whole thing, the witness, said the girlfriend's face looked all chewed up. She had blood pouring out of her nose, blood pouring out of her mouth. She thought she was dead. She was listed in extremely critical condition, and the Highway Patrol spokesman at the time said that if she dies, this becomes a homicide investigation. But she did end up pulling through. He was charged with DUI with serious bodily injury, which is a third-degree felony, driving without a motorcycle license, and driving with a suspended New Jersey license. Bigelow claimed he had a few beers that day, but nothing that he said was overboard. When the test results eventually came back, it showed he had a blood alcohol content of 0.208, which is nearly 3 times the legal limit. I guess his definition of overboard is different from someone half his size. Because that sounds pretty overboard to me. But those results came back weeks later, at which point they issued a warrant for his arrest, but they couldn't find him. They didn't know where he was. So he had an outstanding warrant. And do you know how they finally caught him? When he came to the courthouse the following year to contest a traffic citation stemming from the motorcycle accident. When he got to court, the judge told him there was a months-old warrant for his arrest, and the bailiffs cuffed him and they took him into custody. The quote in the article was, "The troopers were surprised to see him, to be honest. Typically, people who are wanted don't come walking into courtrooms. But lo and behold, he walked in." Amazing. Either he was the stupidest man on earth, or that's just how fucked up on drugs he really was. I'm guessing it was probably the latter and not the former, although he probably was, not to say he wasn't stupid at times, he did a lot of stupid shit in his life, but probably the drugs had a lot to do with that. So his son told a story here on the episode where he went down to Florida for spring break to hang out with his friends, but really he used it as an excuse to go visit his dad. I guess he hadn't seen his dad since he moved down there. Bigelow's girlfriend answered. She answered the phone, and she said, "Oh, he's not available." So he never got to see his dad. But after he flew home, as soon as he got home, Bam Bam called him, and he apologized. And his son reamed him out over the phone, and then 3 weeks later, he was found dead in his home of an accidental overdose. The autopsy said he had toxic levels of cocaine and the anti-anxiety drug benzodiazepine in his system. They also found evidence of heart disease that was a contributing factor in his death. And he was only 45 years old. You know, because he was basically broke when he passed away, there were a lot of wrestlers out of the Northeast who tried to raise money for his funeral, including Afa of the Wild Samoans. Afa ended up speaking with Vince McMahon, and the story has always been that Vince McMahon paid for Bam Bam's funeral. The one in New Jersey. Because apparently he had 2 of them. He had one funeral in New Jersey, and he had one in Florida. Vince paid for the one in New Jersey, and I think some local wrestlers in Florida paid for the other one. Mick Foley, DDP, Bully Ray all attended the funeral in New Jersey, which is more than most wrestler funerals that you hear about, unfortunately. In the episode, the producer asked Dana, what would you say to Scott if he was here now? And she said, "You motherfucker. But through the years of therapy, I know you had no control. It's not your fault. I don't blame you." But she says Scott would expect her to call him a motherfucker first. She also said that she signed all the rights over to her kids. I guess the rights to his likeness, royalties and stuff. So any royalty checks that come in, anything wrestling related, it automatically goes to her kids. So that even in his death, he could still support his children. I thought she came off really likable in the episode. We've seen some exes in these shows that come off as real whack jobs, especially the girlfriend in the Matt Bourne episode. That was not the case here, though. I thought she came off very likable. I really liked the episode. You know, it's a sad story, obviously, what happened to him. I think I filled in the blanks pretty well on the stuff they left out because they can't fit everything in there. But overall, I think it paints a pretty good picture of who the man was. Best big man ever? I wouldn't say the best, but he's in the conversation. He's on the list for sure.